Hi everybody, I'm Tim from troutandfeather.com, and in this fly tying tutorial we're going to tie the Squirmy Wormy. Trust me, it's really easy. But then after the tying, I'm going to show you a little bit more about the pattern with some variations, but most importantly, the types of water and the situations in which I believe it's best fished. Stay tuned. Here's a quick peek at the Squirmy Wormy before we start tying it. You're going to notice there's really not a lot of materials lashed onto this hook. We basically just have a squirmy body, a really nice hook, a slotted bead, and a little bit of wire. We're going to put it all together with some pink thread. So let's get a clean hook in our vise and start tying this one. Here we go with this fast tie. In my Stonfo Transformer vise, I have a Honik H450 BL. It's a size 14, and I'll typically tie the Squirmy Wormy anywhere between sizes 10 down to a size 18. I really like this Honik H450. As you notice, it's a jig hook, and I have it paired with a slotted tungsten bead. And what that's going to do is allow this hook to ride hook point up, to basically get less snags when it's in the water. This H450 also has a very significant gap. Now, if you've Googled the Squirmy Wormy, you'll see some other tyers using other Honik hooks that aren't jig hooks. And what they're actually doing is using a slotted bead, and they're placing the slotted bead on inverted, which will basically allow those hooks to also ride hook point up. In my mind, I really prefer this H450. It's a great jig hook. It's got some excellent holding power. Honik has two main jig hooks that I tie on, the H400 and this one, the 450. And when push comes to shove, I'm always going to go with the 450. It's just one of my favorite jig hooks out there. I have a tungsten slotted bead on it from Hazard Fly Fishing. It's a 3mm. It's one of those disco beads, just gives off a lot of light. Then I have around 6 or 7 turns of .010 wire. You can see about 4 or 5 of them are shoved up into the bead, and there's a couple extending out. I really like to get a lot of weight on this fly, and I'm not afraid to fish it deep. We're going to be using uni thread, but we're not going to be using our normal 8/0. Instead, I have 6/0 thread. The color's pink, and the reason we're going with 6/0 is because it's just a little bit of a larger diameter, which is going to help it get around that squirmy material and not tear it as easily or slice it as easily as that 8/0 might. So to start this, I'm just going to tie it in behind that wire, just so I can have a nice little ramp going up to the wire to cover it with this pink thread. Once you've covered the hook shank, you'll arrive right around the point where the barb would be, and that's where we tie in our Squirmy Wormy material. The one I'm going to be using for this material is a product from Hairline. It's called Castor's Squirmito. The color that I'm using today is pink. There are definitely other vendors out there that sell this material. I've used a lot of them. I just wanted to make sure that I selected one that's pretty readily available. When you pull these out of the bag, you'll notice they're pretty long. They're very flexible. I typically will get 2 out of this squirmy material. So what I'm going to do right away is just cut it in half. Now, I know individuals that definitely tie smaller squirmies, and they can get 3 out of these, but it's not really about that for me. I really just prefer a nice size Squirmy Wormy. Now, when I first tie it on, I tend to tie this material a little bit long. So I'm going to go around 2 shanks from the hook, and that's about going to be the length of that tail section of this squirmy. But be careful. When you first go to tie it in, you're really going to think, I can just take it, and then really lash down on it tight. And if you do that, it's going to slice right through this material. So be careful with it. Just extend it out with that little bit of a tail. And I'm going to make 1 loose wrap, a second loose wrap, and then what I'm going to do after I've made those, I'm going to lift the whole squirm material up, and I'm basically going to do a half parachute around the hook. And what that does is it kind of helps us to lock our thread wraps in place. Then I'm going to place 2 more still relatively loose wraps around that squirmy material, and then wrap forward. And you'll notice that squirm is definitely locked in place. It's going to turn just a hair whenever I start to wrap up this tag end, but it's not going to go anywhere that's really going to affect the performance of this fly. Now, to wrap this forward, it's very simple. You'll just start wrapping. And once you get 2 or 3 wraps, you're going to say to yourself, geez, look at that little section back there. I can see the thread, but don't worry about it. What's nice about this material, as we start winding it near the bead, near the head, it almost kind of self-corrects for us. You just keep winding and it just keeps going back, kind of like an escalator in a sense. So once you get enough going back that you feel, hey, that's kind of covered that thread spot, that's now you're going to be your tie-off spot at the head. Now the tie-off, here's what I like to do. I like to go around, basically so, I'll see if I can show you this. So I'm going to tie it off where this squirmy piece is almost facing the camera. Because whenever I release it, it's going to just have a little bit of a natural tendency to go back. Remember, we don't want to put a lot of thread pressure on it, because if we do, it's going to slice off and you're going to get upset because you paid a little bit of money for these things. So I'll put 3 wraps on right there, and when I let go of it, it's going to basically cover up that little slot in our bead. At that point, I'm just going to pull it back, make two little wraps in front of it, and now we can tie off. I'm going to grab a little bit of Sally Hansen's head cement, place it directly on my thread. And be careful with this 6/0 because it can really build up quickly. I'm going to try to get around 5 turns for my whip finish, maybe 6 depending on what's going on. It looks like I can get 1 more in there with no problem. Now we're left with this really long squirmy piece here. In that case, I'm just going to trim it so it's around the same length as that tail section. And in my mind, I really prefer to leave these a little long because when I get to the water, depending on what's going on, if it's really high, if it's muddy, if it's a little off color, I prefer this squirmy material to be just a little bit long to really capture the fish's attention. However, if the water tends to be a little clearer and maybe I'm going to be fishing it really tight against the bank and I don't want this really loud fly coming down there, then I can simply just grab my nippers and trim off a little bit from each side, shortening the fly and seeing how that does. So it's really up to you. But in my mind, I know I would much rather leave them long before getting there and trimming down because once you've taken that squirmy material away, it's gone forever. So really keep that in mind. So you'll see this is a very quick tie. It's a really neat one. The one little tip or trick that I'll mention to you, if it gets to the point where this top piece that's facing the camera right now, whenever you locked it in, if it accidentally kind of looped down and it was really cocking at an angle, don't worry about it. The only time I really don't like to, the only place I don't like to see that material is if it's really going down and almost covering the hook point. In that case, what you can almost do is just take your fingers and almost unwind that squirmy material, or take this one and try to unwind it a little bit. And you do have a little bit of play in there and a little bit of wiggle to kind of move it around just so you don't have anything interfering with that gap. I really want to make sure that's open so when those fish take this, I can set the hook and have them tight and bring them to hand. So with that said, I hope you agree it's a really quick one. Let's change the camera angle now and talk a little bit about some variations and most importantly, how to fish this puppy. Was I right? That was definitely an easy one to tie. And geez, I really don't know what it is about worms, but fly fishermen just love to tie and fish them. I mean, I can think back over the last 10 or 15 years, some of the more popular ones. I think you all know the red San Juan worm tied out of vermeil. We have Chuck Furimsky's this bugskin wiggler tied out of his leather, and it just really undulates in the water. And now we have this Squirmy Wormy, and geez, does it work? Maybe it's because we used to fish with worms when we were children, but no, I believe it's really because this is a very simple fly, just like some of those other ones, and it catches a lot of trout. I believe the fly's originator, his name is David Hayes, once he kind of stumbled upon this pattern, it really got out there, especially in the hands of the competitive fly fishing world, because just like all of us, they got to tie a bunch of flies quickly, and they have to be very effective. And geez, talk about just a simple fly, a simple material. You throw a bead and a little weight onto that hook, and that's all it takes. But whenever you get this material, really understand that unlike that San Juan worm and Chuck Furimsky's pattern, this one really has a lot of vibration going on whenever it's in the water. So keep that in mind based on the way that you tie it. I really try my best to keep that front edge of it almost leaning forward because I want that water current kind of cocking it back a little bit and having it nudge back to really show that undulation and that life whenever it's in the water. Now let's talk a little bit about the fly tying variations because it looks like it's a really simple pattern, but kind of like that mop fly, if you do a Google search of patterns like this, you're going to see that tyers have really been experimenting with that material. In my mind, however, there are really two main variations. The first one is the obvious. It's the color. There are lots of different colors of this material. I really tend to go with the pink, though there's a glow in the dark that's really neat. There's a chartreuse that I love to use. So trust me whenever I say there's some other colors out there that I would recommend you looking into. But more importantly, whenever I fish this pattern, I tend to be fishing it deep, and it really varies on the type of water that I'm fishing based on maybe a spring creek versus a really deep freestone river. And I want this fly to get to the bottom in a hurry, but I don't want it so heavy that it's going to get stuck down there. Now you'll notice in the video we tied it on a jig hook, which will really help to prevent it from getting snagged all the time, but it's still going to get snagged occasionally. So I like to tie these in different weights. So some of them won't have that wire body. Some of them may have a smaller tungsten bead at the front. I'm always going to have weight to that fly no matter what, but I am going to vary that. So really think about your own box and some of the waterways that you like to fish and those different depths, and think about what type of weight it will require to get this fly to the bottom, but not so much that it's going to just stay in that one spot. Now, I'm not sure if you have a marking system for your patterns. Maybe you use a certain color thread to identify that there's more weight or less weight, or maybe you just have them marked in your box. But if you really do have a unique system, I'd love to hear about it down below in the comment section. Now, most importantly, let's talk about fishing this pattern, because in my mind, a lot of people just think this is one of those flies you put on and it catches fish. Sometimes it does, but not always. I can tell you I've given some of these flies to my friends, and some of my friends started fishing them and did really well. Whereas others fished it for about 10 minutes and said, just okay, took it off, and it hasn't returned to their tippet ever since. What's the difference? Well, in my mind, it's the situation. I tend to fish this fly in two different situations. Number one, I love to use this whenever I'm fishing in lakes for trout. If you check out my Trout and Feather Instagram, you'll see some pictures of some really nice rainbows in the 18 to 23 inch range. A lot of those rainbows were caught on the Squirmy Wormy. So I like to fish this really just off the bottom of the lake, just giving it a little bit of that wiggle action, just kind of vibrating it with the rod tip, just a little bit of a jig of the line, and those trout really seem to slam it in the lake. So that's situation number one. Situation number two is probably one of the more common ones that we're all thinking of, and that's during high water situations. It seems like over the last few years in the spring, we have had just an abundance of water. Well, whenever we get that extra water, it's really just kicking against the sides of the river or the stream bank, and it's exposing some worms. And a lot of these drop into the water. So whenever I get to a waterway and there's really just a lot of water rushing down, that Squirmy Wormy is more than likely going to go onto my tippet somewhere, especially in that tight line nymphing situation. Now, if I'm going to start off with a really heavy one, what I'll probably do is tie on a smaller nymph. It may not be something really flashy. Trout can still find a way to eat muddy water. So maybe something like a blueing olive, a hare's ear, a pheasant tail, and then tied right off the bend of that, I'm going to have a piece of around, say, 15 inches of tippet, somewhere around 5X, and I'm going to put on a really heavy Squirmy Wormy. So in that tight line nymphing situation, I have just that leader, that tight line nymphing leader, going right to, we'll say, 5X down to a pheasant tail, and then around 16, 15 inches going right to that heavy Squirmy Wormy. So I can just feel that squirmy as it's really just going against the stream bottom. I'm going to fish it in a little bit of a slower situation whenever we have high water, but I really want to fish this close to the banks because I believe that's where some of those bigger fish are going to be sitting, just waiting for these worms to come rushing down into their mouth. Once that water starts to subside and get back into kind of its normal flow, I'll still fish the Squirmy, more than likely in a smaller weight situation, and I'll fish it in faster water. It still might be the bottom fly. Sometimes it will be that first fly off, just because I want it a little bit lighter and it may not be that heaviest fly that really holds up the rest of my rig. So those are two of the situations in which I fish it. I guarantee if you look down in the comments section, maybe a month after this video is released, you're going to hear people that are going to tell you it fishes everywhere great. And for some, it really does. I can tell you I've used it on both stocked and wild trout. It's worked equally for both of them. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. The one that I tied in the video, this was from Hairline. It was called Castor's Squirmito. So you'll see this stuff called the Squiggly Wiggly, the Squirmy Wormy, the Squirmito, but it's really just this rubbery material. It almost reminds me of these gel hair bands that my wife uses. Now I'm wondering to myself, maybe I should kind of check those out and see if there's a way that I could kind of replicate it a little bit differently. Well, with that said, thank you everyone for watching this fly tying tutorial of the Squirmy Wormy. If you have any questions or comments, as always, you can email me at tcammisa@gmail.com, or I'd really love to hear from you in the comments section below. What are your thoughts of using this fly? What are some other worm patterns that you use, and is this one that has caught a lot of fish for you? And if it has, can you help some others out there and just talk about those situations in which it's worked really well? If you're into social media, Trout and Feather does have a Facebook and an Instagram account, so please check those out. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, you can check out my website, which is troutandfeather.com. Once again, thank you everybody, and I'll see you next time.
I